I just wanted to welcome everyone to today's webinar, 4 Approaches to Scaling Agile, brought to you by the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development. The Center for Professional and Executive Development offers online and in-person programs and certificates that will give you the modern, relevant skills needed to advance your career. All of our programs offer interactive live learning sessions facilitated by instructors with practical business experience. CPED also partners with organizations to provide customized professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information on the Center for Professional and Executive Development, please visit our website at uwcped.org. And now I'd like to introduce you to today's facilitator, Shawn Belling. Shawn is the CIO at Madison College and an instructor at CPED. Shawn is a globally experienced technology executive, project management speaker, and instructor. He's also an author based here in Madison, Wisconsin. In addition to over 28 years of technology and project leadership experience, Shawn teaches, speaks, and consults for businesses, universities, and professional organizations on various project management topics and practices. Shawn released his book, Succeeding with Agile Hybrids, in November 2020, and he's certified by PMI as a project management professional and Agile certified practitioner. And he's also a certified Scrum professional and certified Scrum at Scale practitioner. Shawn, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Kat. Well, welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you and share a little bit about some approaches to scaling Agile and talking through some of the things that practitioners need to be aware of when you are working in an environment where you want to scale Agile, make progress on your existing implementation of Agile, and just generally working to improve your practices. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about 4 key topics. We're going to spend a few minutes, first of all, talking about a few specific approaches to scaling Agile. Then we'll spend a few minutes talking about the concept of hybrid project methodologies and environments, and how do those manifest, and where are organizations in terms of their position on a continuum where you're thinking about waterfall, you're thinking about Agile practices, and we'll also talk a little bit about how you can bring various elements of different Agile frameworks along with waterfall practices into play to focus on delivering value rapidly and focusing on outcomes such as minimum viable product. We'll spend a bit of time talking about Agile coaching and the importance of Agile coaching, and then we'll wrap things up by talking a little bit about adopting Agile within organizations, some of the typical challenges that many run into, and some thoughts on how best to address those and be prepared for them. And as Kat noted, we will leave some time at the end to have a Q&A session and speak to some follow-up questions anyone might have. So with that, we'll plunge right in. The first few minutes, we're going to talk about 3 fairly common approaches to scaling Agile. We're going to talk about Largescale Scrum, we'll talk about Scaled Agile Framework, and we'll talk a bit about Scrum at Scale. Starting off with the Largescale Scrum. This is a framework that's been around for a while now. 2005, more or less, is when you saw a couple of folks came up with this. They've written a book on this that you can actually go out and find. I've consulted it myself many times. But one of the things that's really important to keep in mind about Largescale Scrum is that this is an approach that leverages the core practices of Scrum. So we're assuming that organizations have Scrum, one of the Agile frameworks, in place as their preferred approach to using Agile, and that they're thinking about how we scale up from maybe one team that's gotten bigger and bigger, or maybe we've got a couple of teams and we want to intentionally find a framework that's going to work for us. And so Largescale Scrum is a framework where an organization can use or leverage it to help multiple teams scale up. But the assumption here is that we're still focusing on the shipping of a single product. So, per the creators of Largescale Scrum, when we talk about scale and we talk about large, we could be thinking about up to 5 teams, give or take. They may be, let me pause before I say this, a lot of these assumptions were made pre-pandemic and with everyone working remotely. But again, the general assumption is that we're talking about teams maybe working at 1 to 2 sites. The creators of Largescale Scrum did consider larger scenarios. So if you're interested in this framework being something that you might want to use for far larger scale, there is another flavor of this that is known as less huge, kind of an interesting name for it, but Largescale Scrum huge, purposely designed as something that could potentially scale far beyond the reach of large-scale Scrum and its focus on a relatively small number of teams. So when we think about large-scale Scrum, a few critical things to keep in mind. Again, the assumption is that we are talking about 1 to 5 teams. The assumption is that we are working in an environment where we're using Scrum and that we've got a pretty solid handle on the core Scrum fundamentals. And single-digit number of teams focused on a single product with a single product owner, a single backlog, and a single Scrum Master. So think about that for a moment. We are assuming that this approach is going to be used to deliver a product. And so you've got that product owner and Scrum Master who are coordinating. They're making sure they're grooming that backlog, but you're distributing the work over up to 5 teams, but still working off of that same backlog. So that also means you're working off of the same sprint cadence. So everybody's following the same, if it's 2 weeks, everybody's on the same sprint cycle. If you are working off of a release plan, all of this work is being coordinated to support a single release. Again, with all of these streams of work from the various teams being coordinated by the Scrum Master, product owner, and ultimately resulting in release of value to a specific product's release plan. At all times, again, large-scale Scrum assumes that the practicing organizations are dedicated to continuing to improve their practice of Scrum, the Scrum values, the use of the Scrum guide, and intentionally working to try to be good at Scrum as part of their approach to scaling. The next approach we'll talk about is Scaled Agile Framework, often abbreviated to SAFe. Scaled Agile Framework is intended from the beginning as a framework that suits large organizations. We're talking about serious scale here. We're talking about multiple products, multiple portfolios, many streams of programs, lots of teams, multiple value streams. So again, this is assuming pretty significant scale. And as such, if you dig into it, and there's a whole variety of certifications related to Scaled Agile Framework, it is more complex than large-scale Scrum, and it's a bit more complex than Scrum at Scale, which we're going to talk about shortly. Scaled Agile Framework is the brainchild of a gentleman named Dean Leffingwell. There is an organization that copyrights Scaled Agile Framework and generates ongoing and updated versions of this framework. And currently, Scaled Agile Framework is operating at version 5. And you can go to the Scaled Agile Framework website and learn a great deal about SAFe, including different information on the versions, diagrams, opportunities for understanding more about the specific framework, and so forth. When we're thinking about ideal applications of Scaled Agile Framework, again, it makes sense for organizations that have to scale out across many, many teams. We also make certain assumptions that an organization that might be interested in and capable of leveraging Scaled Agile Framework has certain other things already in place. Perhaps, for example, they have an IT organization that is operating at scale. They have a product management organization operating at scale. And so one of the things that we're assuming, and one of the things that Scaled Agile Framework can help with, is bringing agile practices to these organizations that are already operating at that scale. We assume that these organizations will either have or rapidly develop things like automated testing and deployment systems and practices, that they will be developing and maintaining architectural roadmaps that build the underlying infrastructure that in turn enables the organization to use SAFe as a way of identifying and delivering product and customer-oriented value streams. we assume that these organizations have certain shared services that they leverage across all of these different structures. So in summary, Scaled Agile Framework is ideal for an organization that already has achieved scale in its operations. It is not necessarily a good fit for relatively small organizations, startups, certainly not, or organizations that just haven't had the opportunity to grow and get in place the scale, the supporting structures that would enable them to operate and take the most advantage of Scaled Agile Framework. The third approach to scaling Agile that we'll talk about is Scrum at Scale. Scrum at Scale came out about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was developed by Scrum co-creator Jeff Sutherland. And just a little personal anecdote, I chose to get my, when I had to think about it, hey, I want to get more background on scaling Agile, what direction do I want to go? I chose to seek more education and ultimately certification in Scrum at Scale, partly because it was an opportunity to get to work directly with Dr. Jeff Sutherland. And so Sutherland describes Scrum at Scale as a logical extension and a logical approach to growing and scaling out Scrum. Once again, just like large-scale Scrum, Scrum at Scale assumes an organization that is using Scrum. They are intentional, they're purposeful at being good at Scrum first, and then looking at what can we do to coordinate and scale our Scrum teams in a way that we can tackle progressively more complex scenarios. As we grow and scale, can we tackle progressively more complex product and solution situations? As with all of the Agile practices, if you kind of look at them in aggregate, one of the core tenets of Agile is a focus on value delivery, and Scrum at Scale is no different. One of the critical outcomes and one of the things that underpins all of the theory and practice behind Scrum at Scale is a very laser focus on value delivery. One of the other elements of Scrum at Scale, espoused by Sutherland and the people who teach and write about Scrum at Scale, is that in theory, I always say in theory, there is no limit to how Scrum at Scale can grow. So, an organization that is relatively small and growing, through 3 to 5 to 7 to 9 teams could be looking at Scrum at Scale. Scrum at Scale is used at organizations as large as the Saab jet aircraft company, where they use Scrum and Scrum at Scale to deliver progressively iterative versions of jet fighter aircraft. So clearly it can scale significantly. What makes Scrum at Scale a good choice for an organization looking to and working on scaling? Again, theoretically, it's applicable to almost any size organization, but the key things, ideally, you're already doing Scrum well. So you're focused on rigorous Scrum practice. Scrum at Scale works fairly well in organizations that are flat. You think about some of your startup software companies that have achieved some scale and some measure of success, but they were agile from day one, and they have intentionally kept their organizational structure relatively flat. What that does with Scrum at Scale is it enables very rapid communication of decisions, information, and impediments up and down the scale. One of the things that you see in Scrum at Scale is the formation of something called an executive action team. The executive action team is expected to maintain a Scrum board similar to those being used by their teams, because the expectation is impediments could be rapidly escalated to the visibility of the executive team, with the expectation that they will then immediately act upon those. And the only way that that can really work is in an environment where you do indeed have a fairly flat organizational structure. There's also an assumption that for Scrum at Scale to be a good fit and to be successful, teamwork, collaboration is embedded in the culture of the company. And in fact, any rewards, what I'll often call variable compensation, i.e. bonuses or other, are structured in such a way that they reward the accomplishments of teams and the commitment and execution by teams as opposed to individuals. So again, the assumption, all of this is kind of baked into, it's in the DNA, it's in the org structure, the culture of the company that wants to leverage Scrum at scale as a way to scale up their Scrum practices. So we have talked about 3 approaches to scaling Agile, and now we're going to move into talking a little bit about the concept of using a hybrid approach to Agile. I start by saying most organizations that are using Agile practices are sitting somewhere on a continuum. If we think about waterfall, or what you may prefer to call traditional or phase-based approaches to project management, on one end of the continuum, and you think about completely, totally, fully Agile organizations on the other end of the continuum, most organizations are sitting somewhere on that continuum. There are a number of reasons for that. We look at, what business is the organization in. I often like to use the example of the company that is building nuclear submarines or power plants or huge buildings, or the kind of deliverables that are intended to have a very long service life. They are physically fairly large. Even though there are elements of innovation, the basics of things like building ships and submarines and power plants don't change all that fast. Because so much strategic input is needed at the start of a project like this. Again, service life. A large ship or a power plant may be in service for 50 or more years. We really need a lot of strategic input up front. That tends to speak to organizations that may be relatively hierarchical with low tolerance for risk. You need a lot of planning up front. At the other end of the spectrum, you have organizations that in fact thrive on risk. And in fact, if they don't take risks, they may not win. They're very focused on innovation. As such, they also tend to have relatively flat organizational structures for the reasons we talked about a little bit earlier. So we assess organizations and we find that they probably stand somewhere on this continuum. And that speaks to an interest in using some combination of waterfall or phase-based practices along with elements of Agile. And so we see these mashups like Agile Fall and Scrumban and Leanban and other, where we're taking intentionally elements of waterfall and we're merging them with elements of Agile to come up with some kind of a hybrid approach. That, in fact, was one of the key reasons that I wrote the book that I did and released last year, is that recognition that know the core practices of Agile and be aware of them, work on getting good at them, but also be aware that you can combine elements of Agile practices along with elements of waterfall or traditional phase-based approaches to create a methodology and approach that could work well for your specific organization's situation and needs. As we look at the Agile frameworks themselves, we can consider elements from Lean and Scrum. We can consider elements from Kanban. We also want to bring in elements of design thinking, where we're starting with that customer and their specific lived experience in mind to help us think about what do we need to build? What approach do we want to take to make sure that we are going to deliver value to that customer? And by considering these different elements, we can build our own hybrid approach that helps us tailor our overall methodology as well as individual approaches to a project to suit the needs of the customer and the product that we are trying to build. When we're thinking Agile, our goal is always rapid value realization. And so we want to be thinking in terms of building a product for a customer and how do we get a minimum viable product in the hands of that customer as rapidly as possible. One, to provide value, but also so we can start gathering feedback and understand what it might take to build progressively improved and expanded versions of that product to continue to satisfy the needs of that customer. The next thing we want to talk a little bit about is Agile coaching. Coaching is very important to organizations that are interested in scaling their Agile practices because, in summary, the role is there to help the organization get better. It's a long-term role. This coach builds relationships with various teams, with Scrum Masters, with product owners, with leaders throughout the organization, all in the interest of working across these different relationships to help the people, the teams in the organization get better results from their Agile practices and to grow their capabilities and maturities and usage of Agile practices. When we look at the coach, there are specific roles that they focus on. Because the Scrum Master role is so critical in the practice of Scrum, the coach will work closely with the Scrum Master. We also know that the product owner role is absolutely crucial. An effective product owner is absolutely important to the success of an Agile team and to the delivery of value, because they decide what done is, they decide what's valuable. And so we want the coach helping them. The coach can work with teams and individual team members and also coach executives to make sure that senior leaders in Agile organizations are fulfilling their responsibilities and meeting their expectations of supporting the organization, supporting their teams to get the most benefit from Agile practices. There are certain scenarios where the Agile coach can be extremely valuable. For example, when you have a brand new team, whether the team itself is completely new to Agile, and not only are they new, but they're learning about the practices and the processes, the coach can be extremely helpful there. Or if the team is versed in Agile, but they're being put together as a brand new team, the coach can work with the Scrum Master and the product owner to help that team, go through some of the phases of team formation that we're aware of: forming, storming, norming, ultimately performing. Those things are all applicable in an Agile environment, and a coach can help with that. One of the critical places an Agile coach can help is when a team is planning its first Agile product release. And so they're beginning to go through the backlog of requirements and begin to form user stories and start to size those user stories and think about how they need to be organized into sprints so that they can deliver a coherent product. And then as they start to do their first round of sprint planning and begin to understand, as we organize our sprints and we prioritize that backlog and figure out what should our first sprint our first sprint look like, that Agile coach can be very helpful in working with the team, working with the Scrum Master, product owner, and the entire team to do that initial planning and help them build out that first sprint plan. When Agile teams are in the middle of sprints and in the middle of releases, the coach can provide a lot of assistance. I like to think of this as, coaching during the game. As a coach in sports, you do a lot of coaching prior to games. You help people get good at technique. You build a game plan, and then you actually go and execute it. During the game itself, the coach is offering tips to help that team perform and get the most out of their efforts. In Agile, it's no different. An Agile coach can observe the team during the sprint, observe the work of the Scrum Master, product owner, and the team, and offer coaching and advice to make sure that each sprint is as valuable and productive as possible. The role of the coach is also important during the sprint reviews that we do at the end of each sprint or iteration. Recall that in Agile, if we're using time boxes we often call sprints, we will do something called the demonstration, where we basically show the product owner and other important stakeholders what was built during that sprint. But then the team steps aside and they examine their own work practices. They look at what went well, things that didn't go as well, and most critically, what might they change going into their next sprint. This is where the Agile coach can also be very valuable. Much like a coach works with their team after each game to assess their performance and think of ways they could immediately improve in the next game, the Agile coach does a similar function with the Agile team. Now that we're coming out of a sprint, what could we do immediately that we could leverage to improve in our very next sprint? When the team gets to the end of a release, the coach provides a lot of value, because much like a coach at the end of a season, this is at the end of a release. The coach can work with the team, the Scrum Master, the product owner, and other important stakeholders in the organization. Now that we have reached this critical milestone and released this product or put this particular system into production, we're going to stand down for a bit and we're going to think about, as we pivot to do our next release, what would we like to do differently throughout the life cycle of this entire release? So again, much like a coach going into a new season, what should we do differently as we exit one season and move into the next? So in summarizing there, the coach provides a lot of really important value and assistance to organizations looking to scale Agile and to the teams and the individual roles actually performing and executing Agile practices. Very quickly, talking about Agile adoption and implementation. What's needed to be successful? What are some challenges and what are some impediments? There's a really good article out there, Brian Rabin, the specific secrets to any successful implementation. Get leadership buy-in. Cultivate your evangelists to spread the word and socialize why this could be successful. Try to leverage Agile practices on a few small projects. Evaluate how it goes. Get a couple of wins and then look to scale it up. Get your organization a common basis in training so you're all speaking the same language. If one group of people read a book and another group of people go to different training, you may have some common theoretical knowledge, but you're not working from that shared basis of training. Work hard to build good processes initially. Really understand what it is that you want to do and do effectively before you try to scale it or get tools to help you. Challenges when we're adopting Agile. Very often, senior leaders think that somehow if we adopt Agile, everything's going to get better. And so they think it's just going to happen. We don't have to make a lot of important changes in order to see the benefits. You sometimes see little tactical things like team members that don't like the daily stand-ups, or they don't want to co-locate or otherwise change their routine to be part of daily stand-ups, regular backlog grooming, retrospectives, that sort of thing. Critically, we see product owners who don't necessarily understand how important their role is, and so they don't engage and provide direction. We see things like the burn down charts and velocity being used to pressure a team. Organizations that want to be successful will work hard to move these impediments. They will make sure that they address any lack of training. They'll move beyond book learning and get people that common basis. They'll change reward structures so that they're rewarding teams as opposed to individuals. They'll make sure that everybody that is part of an Agile team is included in planning, thinking, and training. They'll recognize that this isn't going to be a fast change, but that it's going to take time. So with that, we've got just a couple minutes for questions and answers, and I want to turn it back over to Kat to moderate those and bring forward any that I could answer in the remaining time.
Thank you so much, Shawn. We do have a couple questions and know we're tight on time, so I'm going to pick one if you don't mind. One of the questions that came in was, what happens without coaches? Either coaches aren't available or they're not well received at the organization.
That's a great question. Well, so let's stop for a second. When we think about Scrum specifically, the role of the Scrum Master, among other things, that servant leader role is to help a team maximize their use of Scrum. And so they're expected to do some tactical coaching with their teams. So if you have effective Scrum Masters, you can certainly get value on a team-to-team basis. If those Scrum Masters are speaking to one another, they can share best practices, figure out, what can we do to improve Agile within the organization. So up to a point, the organization can scale without the coaches, provided that they have a strong cohort of Scrum Masters, and provided that those Scrum Masters have solid knowledge and confidence to act as coaches to their own teams and coaches to one another, and coaching to product owners and coaching to executive leaders. If coaches aren't well received, you've got a little bit of a different problem. And in my opinion and experience, you need to step back and ask, why are these coaches not well received? Perhaps it's because the true purpose of the coaches wasn't properly explained. Do you have coaches coming in with the right approach who make their first priority forming relationships with Scrum Masters and product owners and making clear their intent to be helpful? And I'm here to help the team. I'm here to help the organization scale and help you be the best you can be at their role. So, again, if they're not well received, I think the first step is to step back and say, why is that? And how do we address that?
Great. Thank you so much for answering that question. And thank you for the presentation today. Before we wrap everything up, we did want to let our viewers know that these topics are further explored in Agile at Scale Online. This interactive online program taught by Shawn will give you the tools to reduce product delays, better forecast Agile projects, and achieve better integration between Agile and phase-based project teams. Shawn's new book is also included in this program. So we'd love to see you at the next session, which begins on April 22nd. Again, thank you for attending today's webinar, and stay well.